So Keir Starmer's managed to do something genuinely impressive. He's annoyed the King of England while simultaneously embarrassing Britain on the world stage, and not over a war or a budget or a constitutional crisis that required difficult choices. No, he did it by turning King Charles into a diplomatic delivery driver for Donald Trump. Honestly, you almost have to admire the efficiency. This isn't some vague palace whisper or an overheated tabloid rumor. The allegation is stark and brutal. Starmer personally handed Donald Trump a private letter from King Charles in the Oval Office, in full view of cameras, journalists, and the global media, despite the letter being intended for discreet delivery at a carefully chosen moment. The result? A furious monarch, months of palace diplomacy torpedoed, and a Prime Minister now accused of grovelling so hard he forgot how the British Constitution actually works. Let's be clear about the image here. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the supposed restorer of dignity after years of chaos, standing in the Oval Office, passing over a royal letter like a nervous intern, hoping for a good performance review. This is the same Labour leader who spent years lecturing everyone about seriousness, competence, and respect for institutions, and his first big interaction with Trump turned the king into a prop and hoped the cameras catch it. If you're enjoying this level of political self-sabotage, hit subscribe now, because this story has everything: royal fury, constitutional awkwardness, Trump optics, and a prime minister who appears to have confused diplomacy with show and tell. Now, why does this matter? Because this wasn't just any letter. According to multiple reports, the message from King Charles urged Trump to stop referring to Canada as the 51st state. That is extremely delicate territory. It's exactly the sort of soft power intervention the monarchy is uniquely positioned to make, quietly, privately, and without fanfare, so that it doesn't look like political interference. Timing is everything, subtlety is everything, and Starmer managed to detonate both. The palace had reportedly planned for Charles to raise this issue privately at Balmoral, away from cameras, away from ego, away from Trump's instinct to turn everything into a performance. Instead, Starmer hauled the letter out in public, guaranteeing headlines, creating pressure, and making it impossible for the king to plausibly claim neutrality. That's not just clumsy, that's constitutionally illiterate. And before anyone tries to downplay this as just optics, remember, in a constitutional monarchy, optics are substance. The king's power exists precisely because he doesn't appear to wield it. Once you drag him into public political theatre, you break the spell. Starmer didn't just ignore protocol, he undermined the entire mechanism that allows the monarchy to function as a diplomatic asset rather than a political liability. What makes this even worse is the motivation. There was no strategic necessity here, no crisis demanding immediate intervention. This was about optics, about access, about being seen as Trump's chosen interlocutor. Starmer didn't misjudge the room, he chose the camera. And that choice tells you everything. When forced to choose between long-term constitutional stability and short-term political theatre, Starmer picked the photo op. When forced to choose between respecting the king's role and flattering Donald Trump, he picked Trump. That isn't a one-off mistake. It's a window into how this prime minister operates under pressure. This is how you end up with palace insiders, reportedly livid, constitutional experts quietly panicking, and a prime minister trying to explain why he thought publicly delivering private royal correspondence was a good idea. Spoiler, there is no good explanation, and this is only the beginning. To really grasp how badly Keir Starmer misjudged this, you need to understand the one rule that underpins Britain's entire constitutional system. The monarch advises, the politicians act, and neither publicly embarrasses the other. It's an unspoken contract that has kept the whole thing functioning for centuries. And Starmer managed to tear a hole clean through it in one Oval Office appearance. King Charles is not some ceremonial ornament wheeled out for photo opportunities. He has spent decades building relationships, mastering diplomatic nuance, and learning exactly how to apply pressure without ever appearing political. His power lies in discretion, in private words, in timing, and all of that depends on absolute trust between the palace and the Prime Minister. Once that trust is gone, the king's influence evaporates. That's why the reported fury from palace insiders matters so much. This wasn't just irritation. This was a sense that months of careful planning had been casually tossed aside. The letter to Trump wasn't meant to be brandished in public. It was meant to be deployed quietly after groundwork had been laid in a setting where Trump couldn't grandstand and where Charles could maintain plausible neutrality. Starmer didn't just ignore that strategy, he bulldozed it. Imagine spending months planning a delicate intervention, only to watch it turned into a headline because someone wanted to look important. That's the level of amateurism we're talking about here. And it's why sources describe Charles as fuming rather than merely disappointed. Fuming is what happens when someone breaks a rule so fundamental it shouldn't need explaining. And let's talk about the timing. This came as Starmer was desperately trying to position himself as the so-called Trump whisperer, the sensible European leader who could manage the new American administration. Instead of proving he could handle complexity, he proved the opposite, that under pressure, he prioritizes visibility over judgment. In diplomacy, that's lethal. What makes this worse is that Starmer didn't have to do this. There was no obligation to deliver the letter publicly. There was no benefit to Britain in doing so. The only upside was personal optics, a moment that said, look at me, I have access. That's not statecraft, that's insecurity masquerading as diplomacy. And insecurity is a terrible thing for a prime minister to advertise, especially one who built his entire brand on being steady, forensic and process-driven. This is the same man who sold himself as the lawyer who understands institutions, the adult in the room, the guy who respects procedure. Yet when confronted with Trump and a camera, he abandoned procedure instantly. The comparison with previous Labour leaders is damning. Tony Blair, for all his faults, understood that you never publicly weaponize royal diplomacy. Gordon Brown, awkward as he was, didn't turn the Queen into a political accessory. Even Jeremy Corbyn, an open Republican, managed to respect the constitutional boundaries of the monarchy while in office. Starmer, supposedly the safe pair of hands, has now outdone them all in constitutional clumsiness. And here's the truly damaging part. Once you break palace trust, it doesn't bounce back quickly. Every future diplomatic intervention involving the king will now be scrutinized. Every letter, every meeting, every informal channel will come with extra layers of caution. The palace will be less willing to share strategy, more guarded, more distant. That doesn't just weaken Charles, it weakens Britain. Starmer didn't just embarrass himself, he compromised one of the UK's most effective diplomatic tools, and he did it for a moment of attention that lasted about a news cycle. That's not leadership, that's vanity. And if this were an isolated lapse of judgment, Starmer might have wriggled out of it with a carefully worded apology and a few quiet meetings behind palace doors. But it isn't isolated. This incident landed on top of months of simmering tension between Number 10 and the monarchy, turning an awkward mistake into something far more serious, a pattern. Reports throughout 2025 have hinted at growing frustration within the palace over Labour's direction of travel, veteran funding disputes, defence-related budget concerns, cabinet members openly flirting with Republican rhetoric. Individually, none of these are unprecedented. Together, they paint a picture of a prime minister either unwilling or unable to manage the constitutional relationship he's supposed to steward. This is why the reaction to the Trump letter went nuclear. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the final straw. Palace insiders reportedly viewed it as confirmation that Starmer doesn't get the monarchy. Not emotionally, not constitutionally, not strategically, and in that world intent matters far less than impact. Nowhere was this clearer than in the aftermath. Social media exploded with claims of a royal meltdown. Viral videos circulated purporting to show King Charles openly insulting Starmer. They were fake, of course. Deepfakes quickly debunked by fact-checkers. But here's the uncomfortable truth. People believed them. They believed them because the story fit the narrative. And when fake footage feels plausible, you've already lost control of the situation. That's a reputational disaster, not just for Starmer, but for the system itself. The monarchy relies on perceived neutrality. The Prime Minister relies on perceived competence. This episode managed to corrode both at once. And once that perception hardens, facts barely matter. Starmer's defenders insist the letter handover was entirely appropriate, that everything was coordinated, that nothing breached protocol. But those claims collapse under basic scrutiny. If it was appropriate, why the fury? If it was coordinated, why the reports of undermined timing? And if it was all above board, Why has Downing Street been so careful with its wording ever since? Because everyone involved knows the truth. This was a judgment call, and it was the wrong one. The real damage isn't constitutional textbooks, it's human trust. The relationship between a Prime Minister and a monarch is built on quiet confidence that sensitive matters won't be mishandled. Once that confidence cracks, every interaction becomes strained, and that strain bleeds outward into foreign policy, domestic politics, and public confidence. Starmer now finds himself in a uniquely bad position. He can't openly admit fault without acknowledging a breach of protocol. He can't dismiss it without insulting the intelligence of anyone who understands constitutional norms, and he can't blame the palace without triggering a crisis that would dwarf the original mistake. So instead we get silence, vague denials, carefully neutral language, the kind of evasive messaging that convinces nobody and satisfies even fewer. Meanwhile, his critics are circling, not just the usual suspects, but constitutional scholars, former diplomats, and even sympathetic commentators quietly asking the same question. How does someone this obsessed with process get something this basic so wrong? Because this wasn't a policy gamble. It wasn't a strategic risk taken in a crisis. It was a moment of choice between restraint and performance, and Starmer chose performance. That choice will haunt him. Once you demonstrate that you're willing to sacrifice institutional trust for short-term optics, everyone starts recalculating. Allies hesitate, the palace withholds, foreign leaders test boundaries, and the Prime Minister's authority erodes, not in one dramatic collapse, but in a slow, corrosive drip. This wasn't just an awkward photo op, it was the moment Starmer showed how he behaves when the stakes are high and the cameras are on, and that should worry everyone. The political fallout from this mess is where things start to get genuinely dangerous for Keir Starmer, because constitutional blunders don't stay confined to palace corridors. They metastasize slowly at first, then all at once, and Westminster can already smell blood. Inside Parliament, Labour MPs are stuck defending the indefensible. Publicly, they're insisting this was all perfectly routine, that nothing improper occurred, that the Prime Minister acted with complete respect for protocol. Privately, a very different story. The quiet consensus is that Starmer overreached, misjudged the optics, and didn't read the room, which in Westminster speak is code for he messed it up badly. This lands at the worst possible time. Starmer is already battling a reputation for being stiff, over-controlled, and oddly insecure for a man with such a commanding majority. His authority rests not on charisma or ideological loyalty, but on competence. We can take that away, and there's not much left. And nothing punctures the competence narrative faster than a self-inflicted constitutional fiasco involving the king. The opposition, naturally, is having a field day. Conservatives are framing this as proof that Labour can't be trusted with Britain's institutions. Reform UK is milking the optics of national humiliation and grovelling to Trump. Even normally cautious commentators are asking why a Prime Minister who claims to respect tradition keeps blundering into avoidable crises. But the real problem isn't what Starmer's opponents are saying, it's what undecided voters are thinking. The British public might not care about the finer points of royal protocol, but they understand embarrassment, they understand awkwardness, and they understand when a leader looks out of their depth. Handing a royal letter to Trump on camera doesn't look dignified, it looks desperate, and desperation is contagious. This episode reinforces an emerging pattern in Starmer's leadership. Under pressure, he defaults to optics over substance. We've seen it in policy U-turns, we've seen it in his handling of Trump, and now we've seen it in his relationship with the monarchy. The through line is insecurity. A constant need to be seen doing something, even when doing nothing would be wiser. That's why the palace's response matters so much. If reports are accurate, trust has been damaged. And once the palace starts second-guessing number 10, the consequences ripple outward. The king becomes more cautious, diplomatic channels narrow, soft power weakens, and Britain loses one of its quiet advantages on the global stage. Starmer's team now faces an impossible task, repairing a relationship that can't be publicly discussed. You can't hold a press conference to apologize to the monarch. You can't issue a statement clarifying constitutional boundaries without admitting you crossed them. Everything has to happen in private, behind the scenes, in a climate of tension that Starmer himself created. And even if fences are quietly mended, the perception remains. The image is locked in. A prime minister so eager to impress Donald Trump that he used the king as a prop. Fair or not, that's the story people remember. And politics, especially at this level, runs on remembered images more than footnotes. The cruel irony is that Starmer didn't need to do any of this. He wasn't under threat. He wasn't isolated. He wasn't being sidelined. But he acted like someone who was, and in doing so he made that insecurity visible to everyone, from Buckingham Palace to the Oval Office. Once that happens, authority doesn't vanish overnight. It leaks away, quietly, relentlessly, and Starmer has just sprung another leak. So this is where Keir Starmer now stands, a prime minister who promised competence and dignity, but has instead managed to create unnecessary constitutional tension with his own head of state, while humiliating himself in front of a former and potentially future US president. And all for what? A photograph, a moment, a handshake that didn't even buy him the influence he seemed so desperate to secure. This isn't about being anti-monarchy or pro-monarchy. It's about understanding the system you're entrusted to run. Britain's constitutional arrangement only works because everyone involved knows their role and respects its limits. The king advises quietly. The prime minister governs openly. When those lines blur, the entire structure starts to wobble. Starmer didn't just blur them, he bulldozed them. What makes this especially damaging is the contrast between rhetoric and reality. Starmer sold himself as the forensic lawyer, the process guy, the man who understands institutions inside out. Yet when it mattered, he ignored protocol, undermined palace diplomacy, and chose short-term optics over long-term statecraft. That isn't a slip, that's a failure of judgment. And judgment is the one thing voters expect a prime minister to have in abundance. The broader implications are grim. Foreign leaders will now wonder whether sensitive communications with Britain are safe from political theatre. The palace will inevitably tighten control over diplomatic engagements. Future interventions by the king will be more cautious, more limited, and therefore less effective. Britain loses influence not in a dramatic collapse, but through slow attrition. Domestically, Starmer takes a hit from every direction. Monarchists see disrespect, Republicans see incompetence, centrists see amateurism, and his critics see a man so insecure about his global standing that he's willing to compromise constitutional norms for validation from Donald Trump. That's not the image of a confident leader. That's the image of someone still auditioning for the role. The tragedy here is that none of this was necessary. Discretion would have cost nothing. Patience would have preserved trust. Silence would have been the most powerful move of all. Instead, Starmer chose visibility, and in doing so exposed a deeper flaw in his leadership, a persistent fear of being sidelined, ignored, or deemed irrelevant. Strong leaders don't need to perform their importance. They assume it. So here's the bottom line. Keir Starmer didn't just mishandle a letter. He mishandled a constitutional relationship, damaged Britain's diplomatic credibility, and reinforced the perception that under pressure he reaches for optics rather than wisdom. When palace insiders are reportedly furious, when fake videos of royal anger feel believable, and when the public narrative hardens around incompetence, the damage is already done. This episode will fade from headlines, but it won't disappear. It will resurface every time Starmer talks about competence. Every time he lectures others on standards, every time he claims to respect institutions, because now there's a receipt. Watch what happens next. Watch whether the palace distances itself. Watch whether Starmer overcorrects or doubles down. Watch whether this becomes another entry in the growing list of moments that suggest he isn't quite the steady hand he promised to be. Because when a prime minister manages to anger the king, embarrass the country, and gain nothing in return, that's not bad luck. That's bad leadership.